Something strange just happened in the WNBA, and the internet noticed immediately. A young superstar sat down in front of a microphone and calmly explained that the league needed to keep playing basketball, that the season mattered, that the game had to stay on the court if the league wanted to grow. The statement sounded completely reasonable, professional, even mature. But here's where things got interesting, because just a few months earlier, another player said almost the exact same thing. Same message, same logic, same warning about protecting the future of the league. Yet the reaction couldn't have been more different. When Caitlin Clark delivered that message earlier in the negotiations, the response from parts of the media and the online basketball world was explosive. Critics accused her of undermining the union. Some fans claimed she was siding with ownership. Others argued she didn't understand the realities veteran players were facing. The conversation spiraled quickly. But when Paige Bueckers stepped forward and delivered nearly the same exact idea about wanting the season to happen and solving the situation professionally, the backlash never came. No outrage, no viral criticism, just silence. And in today's internet era, silence can be louder than any headline. Fans immediately began pulling up old clips, comparing quotes, reposting interviews, lining the two statements up side by side like evidence in a courtroom. Within hours, the debate exploded across basketball social media. Was there a double standard? Was the reaction shaped by media narratives, team loyalties, player relationships, or something deeper happening inside the league itself? Because the truth is, this moment didn't appear out of nowhere. Behind the scenes, the WNBA is going through one of the most intense internal battles in its history. A battle involving money, power, growth, and the future direction of the sport. Owners and players are negotiating one of the most important labor agreements the league has ever faced. The stakes are enormous. Billions of dollars in future media deals, rising attendance, new sponsorships, and a wave of young stars bringing unprecedented attention to women's basketball. But as the league grows, so does the tension. Some players believe this moment should be used to push aggressively for massive financial changes. Others believe the league's momentum must be protected at all costs. And right in the middle of that debate are two of the biggest young stars in the sport, Caitlin Clark and Paige Bueckers, two players who represent the next generation of the WNBA, but who suddenly found themselves at the center of one of the most heated conversations in modern basketball. Because when their nearly identical messages about the league's future received completely different reactions, it exposed something that many fans had quietly suspected for months. The WNBA isn't just negotiating a contract right now. It's navigating a growing divide. And what happened next would push that divide into the spotlight in a way no one expected. To understand why this moment has sparked such a massive debate, you have to step back and look at what's happening to the WNBA right now. Because the league is experiencing something it has never seen before. Momentum. For years, the WNBA slowly built its foundation. Loyal fans supported the league, talented players elevated the level of play, and the sport continued to grow at a steady pace. But over the last few seasons, something changed. Women's basketball suddenly exploded into the mainstream sports conversation. College stars became national celebrities. Games started drawing massive television audiences. Arena attendance began climbing. Merchandise sales skyrocketed. And social media turned several players into global stars almost overnight. At the center of that surge was a new generation of players who brought an entirely new spotlight to the sport. Players who could shoot from anywhere on the floor. Players who carried massive fan bases from their college careers. Players who turned every game into a viral moment. And perhaps no player represented that shift more than Caitlin Clark. Clark's arrival didn't just bring talent to the court. It brought attention, headlines, debate, crowds that hadn't been seen before in women's basketball arenas. Her game started drawing viewers who had never watched the WNBA before. People who suddenly wanted to see what the hype was about. But with that surge in popularity came something else. Money. More viewers meant more advertising revenue. More attention meant bigger sponsorship deals. And most importantly, it meant the potential for massive television contracts. In professional sports, television money changes everything. When media rights deals grow, the financial structure of a league shifts dramatically. Salaries rise. Team values increase. Owners invest more resources. And players start asking an important question. If the league is making more money, Shouldn't the players share in that growth? That question is exactly what led the WNBA Players Association and league ownership into intense negotiations over the next collective bargaining agreement. For those unfamiliar with how sports leagues work, the CBA essentially determines how money is distributed across the league. It sets salary structures, revenue-sharing rules, player benefits, travel standards, and a long list of financial details that determine how players are compensated. These negotiations happen periodically in every major sports league. But this particular negotiation is happening during one of the most important moments in the WNBA's history, because the league is growing faster than ever. And when growth happens, everyone wants a bigger share of the future. Veteran players, many of whom spent years helping build the league's foundation, believe they deserve significant financial improvements after decades of underpaid salaries compared to other professional athletes. Many of them have played through years when the league struggled financially, years when exposure was limited, years when players had to compete overseas in the off-season just to earn enough money. From their perspective, the current moment is the result of that long struggle, and they believe the time has come to push hard for major financial progress. Higher salary caps, bigger contracts, greater revenue sharing with the league. But negotiations like this are rarely simple, because the owners also have their own perspective. Even with rising popularity, professional sports leagues still operate as businesses. Owners consider long-term financial sustainability. They evaluate operating costs, marketing investments, travel expenses, arena partnerships, and the financial risk involved in expanding salaries too quickly. And when those two perspectives collide, players seeking larger shares and owners protecting financial models, negotiations can become intense. Sometimes extremely intense. In fact, as these negotiations began heating up, discussions of a potential strike started surfacing. A strike in professional sports means players refuse to play games until an agreement is reached. And while strikes have happened before in other leagues, they always come with major consequences. Games get canceled. Fans lose interest. Sponsors grow nervous. Broadcast partners reconsider deals. In short, the entire momentum of a growing league can be disrupted. That's why the possibility of a strike immediately became one of the most controversial topics surrounding the WNBA negotiations. Some players believed it was necessary leverage. Others worried it could damage the league's momentum during its most important growth period. And this is exactly where Caitlin Clark entered the conversation. When reporters asked her about the situation, Clark didn't deliver a fiery speech about negotiations or ownership. Instead, she offered a calm observation. She explained that the league was experiencing a huge moment right now, and that protecting that moment mattered. The product needed to stay on the court. Fans needed games to watch. The league needed continued exposure. In other words, the best way to grow the financial future of the WNBA was to keep playing basketball. It wasn't a rejection of better salaries. It wasn't an attack on the union. It was simply a reminder that the league's momentum depended on keeping the sport visible. But the reaction to that comment quickly became complicated. Some people praised Clark for acknowledging the business realities of professional sports. Others felt the statement came at the wrong time during sensitive negotiations. The internet debate started immediately, but no one expected what would happen months later, when Paige Bueckers stepped into the same conversation and delivered a message that sounded almost identical. And when that happened, the reaction revealed something that shocked the entire basketball world. By the time Caitlin Clark spoke about the negotiations, the WNBA was already sitting on top of a pressure cooker. Every interview felt loaded. Every comment from players or executives was analyzed by fans, media personalities, and social media accounts looking for the next headline. And Clark, whether she liked it or not, had already become the most visible face of the league's new era. That level of attention changes everything. When a role player speaks, the comment might stay within basketball circles. But when someone with Clark's level of influence says something, it spreads across the entire sports world within minutes. So when reporters asked her about the ongoing negotiations and the possibility of a strike, everyone leaned in to hear what she would say. Would she support the union's toughest demands? Would she criticize ownership? Would she stay completely neutral? Instead, Clark delivered something different. Something that sounded less like a typical athlete answer and more like someone thinking about the bigger picture of the league. She talked about the importance of the moment the WNBA was experiencing. She talked about the incredible growth women's basketball was seeing. And then she said something that would instantly become the center of the debate. The league needed to keep playing. Not because players shouldn't negotiate hard. Not because financial progress didn't matter. But because the product itself, the games, the excitement, the visibility, was what allowed the league to grow in the first place. If games stopped, that growth could slow down. Fans might move on. Sponsors might hesitate. Networks might start questioning their investments. Clark's point was simple. The WNBA was experiencing the biggest surge of attention it had ever seen, and protecting that momentum should be a priority. At first, the comment didn't seem controversial at all. In fact, many fans interpreted it as a practical observation about how professional sports work. But within hours, the conversation began shifting. Certain voices online started questioning the timing of the comment. Some argued that discussing compromise during negotiations could weaken the players' bargaining power. Others claimed Clark didn't fully understand the financial struggles many players had faced throughout their careers. Then the conversation became even more heated. Critics began pointing to Clark's endorsement deals and sponsorship opportunities. They suggested that her financial situation was very different from many veteran players who had spent years earning far smaller salaries. According to those critics, it was easier to talk about protecting the league's momentum when you already had significant income outside of basketball. Supporters pushed back immediately. They argued that Clark's point had nothing to do with rejecting fair pay or undermining negotiations. She had simply acknowledged that the WNBA's biggest advantage right now was its growing popularity. Canceling games during such a critical growth period could risk damaging that progress. The debate quickly spilled across sports talk shows, podcasts, and social media platforms. Some commentators praised Clark's maturity. Others questioned whether young players should speak publicly about union strategy. Suddenly, a simple comment about keeping the league moving forward had turned into one of the most polarizing topics in women's basketball. But what made the situation even more complicated was the way the internet reacted to the backlash itself. Clips of Clark's interview spread everywhere. Fans replayed the quote repeatedly, trying to understand exactly what she meant. Some insisted her message was completely reasonable. Others believed the criticism she received proved how sensitive the negotiations had become. The situation slowly cooled down over the following weeks, but the debate never fully disappeared. People remembered the comment. People remembered the reaction. And more importantly, people remembered how quickly the conversation turned against Clark in certain circles. At the time, most observers assumed the controversy would simply fade away. After all, labor negotiations in sports often produce heated debates that eventually settle once an agreement is reached. But the internet has a long memory. And a few months later, when another superstar addressed the exact same issue, fans suddenly remembered everything. Because this time, the reaction looked completely different. Paige Bueckers has been one of the most anticipated players in women's basketball for years. Long before she reached the professional stage, she had already built a reputation as one of the most exciting players in the sport. Her college career was filled with highlight plays, major awards, and the kind of star power that makes fans circle games on their calendars months in advance. By the time she entered the WNBA conversation, expectations were enormous. Many analysts believed Bueckers represented the next wave of talent that would continue pushing the league into the spotlight. So when she sat down for an interview and was asked about the ongoing labor negotiations, fans were curious to hear her perspective. The situation surrounding the CBA had only grown more intense. The deadline was approaching. Rumors about possible strikes or delays continued circulating. Every public comment from players carried weight. When Bueckers began speaking about the situation, her tone was calm and thoughtful. She explained that players wanted the negotiations to work. She talked about professionalism. She talked about the importance of continuing to compete and do what players love to do, play basketball. Then she said something that immediately caught the attention of fans who had been following the earlier controversy. She emphasized that players didn't want a strike. They wanted a season. They wanted to handle the situation professionally and keep moving forward. For many viewers, the message sounded perfectly reasonable. But for others it sounded incredibly familiar. Within minutes of the interview circulating online, fans began making comparisons. Old clips of Caitlin Clark's interview started resurfacing. People placed the quotes side by side. Both players had emphasized protecting the season. Both players had talked about the importance of playing basketball. Both players had highlighted the need to approach negotiations professionally. The similarities were striking. And that's when the internet started asking the question that would ignite the next wave of debate. If the message was basically the same, why had the reactions been so different? Because while Clark's comments had sparked intense criticism in some circles, Bueckers' message was largely received without the same backlash. No major wave of outrage. No viral accusations. No heated criticism dominating sports discussions. Instead, the reaction was mostly quiet. Some fans praised Bueckers for her maturity. Others simply shared the clip without controversy. And that contrast was impossible for the internet to ignore. Screenshots comparing the two statements began spreading rapidly. Posts highlighting the difference in reactions gained thousands of likes and shares. Comment sections filled with arguments about fairness, media narratives, and the complex relationships within women's basketball. Some fans believed the entire situation exposed a clear double standard. Others argued that the context around the comments was different. But regardless of which side people took, one thing became undeniable. The debate surrounding the WNBA negotiations had now evolved into something bigger. It wasn't just about salaries or revenue sharing anymore. It had become a conversation about perception, about who gets criticized, about who gets protected, and about how narratives form around players in the modern sports media landscape. But just when fans thought the controversy couldn't grow any bigger, another voice entered the conversation. And this time, the debate shifted away from comments about strikes and seasons towards something that would spark an entirely new argument about money, expectations, and the reality of professional sports finances. That voice belonged to veteran guard Natasha. And what she said next would push the entire conversation into even more explosive territory. The moment fans realized how similar the two statements were, the internet went into detective mode. Within hours, clips of Caitlin Clark's interview from months earlier started resurfacing everywhere. Basketball pages posted the video. Sports debate accounts reposted it. Fans clipped the quotes and placed them next to Paige Bueckers' interview like two pieces of evidence sitting side by side. And once people saw them together, the reaction was immediate, because the similarities were impossible to ignore. Clark had said the league needed to keep playing. Bueckers had said the players wanted a season. Clark emphasized protecting the momentum of the WNBA. Bueckers emphasized professionalism and continuing to compete. Different wording, but almost identical logic. That's when the comment sections exploded. Fans began asking a question that quickly spread across basketball discussions everywhere. Why was one statement treated like a controversy, while the other passed without major backlash? Posts highlighting the comparison started gaining massive engagement. Thousands of likes. Thousands of comments. People debating every possible explanation. Some fans believed the reaction revealed a clear bias in how certain players are treated by media narratives. Others argued that Clark's comment simply came at a more sensitive moment in the negotiations. But the more the clips circulated, the more the conversation grew. One viral post summed up the entire debate in a single sentence. Same message, different reaction. That line started appearing everywhere. Fans repeated it across comment sections. Basketball podcasts began discussing it. Even people who hadn't been closely following the negotiations suddenly became interested in the story. Because sports fans love controversy. And nothing spreads faster online than a debate about fairness. Some fans believed Clark had been unfairly criticized months earlier. They pointed out that her comments had been interpreted as anti-union by certain critics, even though she had never rejected the idea of better pay or improved conditions. In their view, Clark had simply acknowledged the importance of protecting the league's momentum. Now, seeing Bueckers deliver a similar message without the same level of backlash made them question the original reaction. But not everyone agreed. Some observers argued that the context surrounding the comments had been completely different. They said Clark's statement came during a particularly intense phase of negotiations when tensions were higher. Others pointed out that Bueckers had framed her comments more carefully around professionalism and player unity. In other words, according to those voices, the two moments weren't as identical as fans were claiming. The debate quickly turned into a full-blown internet argument. Threads discussing the topic stretched for thousands of comments. Fans dissected every detail of the interviews. They analyzed tone, timing, and wording. They debated how media coverage influenced public perception. And as the conversation spread, it revealed something interesting about modern sports culture. Today, fans don't just watch games. They analyze narratives. They study how stories are framed. They question how athletes are portrayed in the media. And when something looks inconsistent, they notice immediately. That's exactly what happened here. Because to many observers, the contrast between the reactions felt too obvious to ignore. Some believed it showed how quickly public opinion can shift depending on who is speaking. Others believed the entire debate was exaggerated by social media. But regardless of where people stood, one thing became clear. The WNBA negotiations had now become a massive online conversation. What began as a discussion about contracts and salaries had transformed into something much bigger. A debate about player perception, a debate about media narratives, and a debate about the complicated dynamics inside one of the fastest-growing sports leagues in the world. But while fans were arguing about Clark and Bueckers, another storyline was quietly gaining momentum. A storyline involving one of the most outspoken veteran players in the league. Because as negotiations continued, some players began speaking more openly about what they believed the league owed them. And one of those voices belonged to Natasha Cloud. When Cloud stepped forward to explain her perspective on the financial situation surrounding the league, her comments would trigger another wave of controversy. Because this time, the debate wasn't about media reactions. It was about money, real money, salaries, taxes, cost of living, and the complicated question of how much professional athletes should actually earn as a league grows. And once those comments went viral, the conversation surrounding the WNBA negotiations exploded all over again. While the internet was still arguing about the Clark and Bueckers situation, another voice entered the conversation and shifted the entire debate in a completely different direction. This time, the focus wasn't on young stars or media reactions. It was on one of the league's most outspoken veteran players, Natasha Cloud. Cloud has never been a quiet presence in the WNBA. Throughout her career, she has been known as someone willing to speak openly about issues both on and off the court. Whether it involves social topics, league policies, or player treatment, Cloud has consistently made it clear that she believes athletes should use their platforms to advocate for change. So when the conversation turned toward the ongoing CBA negotiations, it wasn't surprising that Cloud stepped forward to share her perspective. And her comments immediately grabbed attention. Because she wasn't just talking about general improvements or long-term growth. She was talking about the financial realities players face right now. During an interview discussing the proposed salary increases being negotiated, Cloud explained that the numbers being discussed didn't tell the full story. On paper, some of the proposed changes looked significant. Players could see major salary increases compared to previous seasons. For many athletes who had spent years earning relatively modest professional salaries, these raises represented an important step forward. But Cloud pointed out something she believed fans weren't considering: the reality of where players live and how professional income actually works. She explained that a salary increase might sound huge when you look at the raw number. But once taxes are taken out, once housing costs are factored in, once everyday expenses in major cities are considered, the actual amount players take home can look very different. Her point was that financial discussions shouldn't only focus on the headline numbers. They should also consider the cost of living in cities where teams are located, especially in markets where rent and housing prices can be extremely high. Within minutes, the clip began spreading across basketball social media. And just like the earlier controversies, reactions poured in from every direction. Some fans strongly supported Cloud's argument. They believed she was highlighting a reality many professional athletes face when playing in expensive cities. Supporters argued that players deserve compensation that reflects both the league's growth and the economic realities of the places they live and work. From their perspective, Cloud was simply advocating for fair treatment in a league that is finally starting to generate significant revenue. But others reacted very differently. Some critics argued that focusing on taxes and housing costs made the complaints sound disconnected from the financial challenges faced by ordinary workers. They pointed out that nearly everyone who earns a paycheck deals with taxes. Nearly everyone who works in major cities has to pay rent. From that viewpoint, the comments felt out of touch with the financial realities of the average fan watching the debate unfold. The internet once again split into two sides. Supporters believed Cloud was bravely speaking up for players who had historically been underpaid. Critics believed the argument sounded unrealistic when compared to the incomes of most people outside professional sports. The debate quickly became one of the most talked-about aspects of the WNBA negotiations. Sports talk shows began discussing the clip. Podcasts debated the financial structure of the league. Fans argued in comment sections about what professional athletes should expect financially as a league grows. But beyond the surface arguments about taxes and salaries, something deeper was happening inside the league itself. Because the conversation was beginning to reveal a growing divide between two different groups of players. Veterans who had spent years fighting for better pay, and a younger generation entering the league during its biggest surge in popularity. Both groups wanted the league to succeed. Both groups wanted players to earn more money. But they didn't always agree on how to reach that goal. Some believed the moment called for aggressive financial demands. Others believed protecting the league's rapid growth was just as important. And as the negotiations continued, that difference in perspective started becoming more visible. What fans were witnessing wasn't just a contract negotiation anymore. It was the beginning of a generational debate about the future direction of the WNBA. A debate about strategy, a debate about timing, and a debate about how to balance progress with stability. Because as the league stands on the edge of its biggest financial era, yet, the decisions being made right now could shape the future of women's basketball for years to come. But the real tension was only starting to emerge. Because when you looked closely at the voices speaking the loudest during this debate, a clear pattern began to appear. A pattern that suggested the WNBA might be experiencing something far more complicated than a simple labor negotiation. It might be experiencing a shift in leadership. A shift between the players who built the league and the players who could define its future. And that shift was about to become impossible to ignore. As the debate around Natasha Cloud's comments spread across the basketball world, something else slowly started becoming clear. This wasn't just an argument about taxes. It wasn't just about salary numbers. And it definitely wasn't only about social media reactions. Underneath all the headlines and online debates, a deeper tension was starting to surface inside the league. A tension between two generations of players. On one side were the veterans. Players who had spent years building the WNBA into what it is today. Players who had traveled through the difficult seasons when the league struggled for attention, when salaries were far smaller, and when many athletes had to leave the country every offseason just to earn enough money playing overseas. For those veterans, the current moment represented something huge. Finally, the league was gaining mainstream attention. Finally, television networks were investing more money. Finally, sponsorships and partnerships were expanding. From their perspective, this was the moment they had been fighting for during their entire careers. And they believed it was time to push hard for the financial rewards that came with that growth. Higher salaries, better benefits, a larger share of the league's revenue. For them, the negotiations weren't just about numbers on a contract. They were about recognition. Recognition for years of work that helped bring the WNBA to the point it had finally reached. But on the other side of the conversation was a new generation of players entering the league during its biggest surge in popularity. Players like Caitlin Clark. Players like Paige Bueckers. Athletes who arrived in the WNBA already carrying massive fan bases from their college careers. These players stepped into a league that looked very different from the one veterans had experienced earlier in their careers. A league with record television ratings, packed arenas, corporate sponsors paying close attention, and millions of new fans discovering women's basketball for the first time. Because of that momentum, many younger players seemed focused on something slightly different. Growth. Not just immediate financial gains, but long-term expansion of the league's popularity and financial power. They understood that the more attention the WNBA attracted, the larger the future financial opportunities would become. More fans meant bigger television deals. Bigger television deals meant larger salary caps. Larger salary caps meant higher contracts for everyone. Throughout her career, she has been known as someone willing to speak openly about issues both on and off the court. Whether it involves social topics, league policies, or player treatment, Cloud has consistently made it clear that she believes athletes should use their platforms to advocate for change. So when the conversation turned toward the ongoing CBA negotiations, it wasn't surprising that Cloud stepped forward to share her perspective. And her comments immediately grabbed attention. Because she wasn't just talking about general improvements or long-term growth. She was talking about the financial realities players face right now. During an interview discussing the proposed salary increases being negotiated, Cloud explained that the numbers being discussed didn't tell the full story. On paper, some of the proposed changes looked significant. Players could see major salary increases compared to previous seasons. For many athletes who had spent years earning relatively modest professional salaries, these raises represented an important step forward. But Cloud pointed out something she believed fans weren't considering: the reality of where players live and how professional income actually works. She explained that a salary increase might sound huge when you look at the raw number. But once taxes are taken out, once housing costs are factored in, once everyday expenses in major cities are considered, the actual amount players take home can look very different. Her point was that financial discussions shouldn't only focus on the headline numbers. They should also consider the cost of living in cities where teams are located, especially in markets where rent and housing prices can be extremely high. Within minutes, the clip began spreading across basketball social media. And just like the earlier controversies, reactions poured in from every direction. Some fans strongly supported Cloud's argument. They believed she was highlighting a reality many professional athletes face when playing in expensive cities. Supporters argued that players deserve compensation that reflects both the league's growth and the economic realities of the places they live and work. From their perspective, Cloud was simply advocating for fair treatment in a league that is finally starting to generate significant revenue. But others reacted very differently. Some critics argued that focusing on taxes and housing costs made the complaints sound disconnected from the financial challenges faced by ordinary workers. They pointed out that nearly everyone who earns a paycheck deals with taxes. Nearly everyone who works in major cities has to pay rent. From that viewpoint, the comments felt out of touch with the financial realities of the average fan watching the debate unfold. The internet once again split into two sides. Supporters believed Cloud was bravely speaking up for players who had historically been underpaid. Critics believed the argument sounded unrealistic when compared to the incomes of most people outside professional sports. The debate quickly became one of the most talked about aspects of the WNBA negotiations. Sports talk shows began discussing the clip. Podcasts debated the financial structure of the league. Fans argued in comment sections about what professional athletes should expect financially as a league grows. But beyond the surface arguments about taxes and salaries, something deeper was happening inside the league itself. Because the conversation was beginning to reveal a growing divide between two different groups of players: veterans who had spent years fighting for better pay, and a younger generation entering the league during its biggest surge in popularity. Both groups wanted the league to succeed. Both groups wanted players to earn more money. But they didn't always agree on how to reach that goal. Some believed the moment called for aggressive financial demands. Others believed protecting the league's rapid growth was just as important. And as the negotiations continued, that difference in perspective started becoming more visible. What fans were witnessing wasn't just a contract negotiation anymore. It was the beginning of a generational debate about the future direction of the WNBA. A debate about strategy, a debate about timing, and a debate about how to balance progress with stability. Because as the league stands on the edge of its biggest financial era, yet, the decisions being made right now could shape the future of women's basketball for years to come. But the real tension was only starting to emerge. Because when you looked closely at the voices speaking the loudest during this debate, a clear pattern began to appear. A pattern that suggested the WNBA might be experiencing something far more complicated than a simple labor negotiation. It might be experiencing a shift in leadership, a shift between the players who built the league and the players who could define its future. And that shift was about to become impossible to ignore. As the debate around Natasha Cloud's comments spread across the basketball world, something else slowly started becoming clear. This wasn't just an argument about taxes. It wasn't just about salary numbers. And it definitely wasn't only about social media reactions. Underneath all the headlines and online debates, a deeper tension was starting to surface inside the league. A tension between two generations of players. On one side were the veterans, players who had spent years building the WNBA into what it is today. Players who had traveled through the difficult seasons when the league struggled for attention, when salaries were far smaller, and when many athletes had to leave the country every offseason just to earn enough money playing overseas. For those veterans, the current moment represented something huge. Finally, the league was gaining mainstream attention. Finally, television networks were investing more money. Finally, sponsorships and partnerships were expanding. From their perspective, this was the moment they had been fighting for during their entire careers, and they believed it was time to push hard for the financial rewards that came with that growth. Higher salaries, better benefits, a larger share of the league's revenue. For them, the negotiations weren't just about numbers on a contract. They were about recognition. Recognition for years of work that helped bring the WNBA to the point it had finally reached. But on the other side of the conversation was a new generation of players entering the league during its biggest surge in popularity. Players like Caitlin Clark, players like Paige Bueckers, athletes who arrived in the WNBA already carrying massive fan bases from their college careers. These players stepped into a league that looked very different from the one veterans had experienced earlier in their careers. A league with record television ratings, packed arenas, corporate sponsors paying close attention, and millions of new fans discovering women's basketball for the first time. Because of that momentum, many younger players seemed focused on something slightly different. Growth. Not just immediate financial gains, but long-term expansion of the league's popularity and financial power. They understood that the more attention the WNBA attracted, the larger the future financial opportunities would become. More fans meant bigger television deals. Bigger television deals meant larger salary caps. Larger salary caps meant higher contracts for everyone. So while veterans pushed aggressively for financial improvements right now, many younger stars emphasized protecting the league's momentum, making sure the season happened, making sure the games stayed visible, making sure the new fans who had just discovered the WNBA didn't disappear during a labor dispute. Neither perspective was necessarily wrong. Both sides wanted the same ultimate outcome, a stronger league where players are compensated fairly. But they approached the strategy differently. Veterans believed pressure was necessary. Young stars believed stability was critical. And when those two approaches collided during sensitive negotiations, the conversation naturally became complicated. Fans started noticing it. Media outlets began discussing it. Some analysts described the situation as a classic sports transition moment, a league moving from one generation of stars to another. Moments like that often bring tension. Not because players dislike each other, but because different experiences shape different priorities. Veterans remember the years of struggle. Young stars see the opportunity ahead. And both sides feel strongly about protecting what they believe matters most. The Clark and Bueckers situation unintentionally highlighted that divide. Two young players talking about protecting the season. Veteran voices pushing harder negotiation strategies. The internet reacting to every comment like it was part of a much larger battle. But inside the league, many players likely understood something that fans often forget. These negotiations are complicated, extremely complicated. Behind the scenes, union representatives, league executives, lawyers, and financial analysts are all involved in shaping the final agreement. Public comments rarely tell the entire story. Still, the public debate kept growing louder. Because the closer the negotiations moved toward their deadline, the more pressure everyone began to feel. A deadline that was now approaching faster than anyone expected. And if an agreement wasn't reached soon, the consequences could affect not just the players involved in the negotiations, but the entire future of the league. Because the WNBA was standing at one of the most important crossroads in its history. And the next decision could determine whether its historic momentum continued or suddenly slowed down. As the days continued ticking by, the tension surrounding the negotiations became impossible to ignore. The deadline for a new agreement was approaching. And in professional sports, deadlines have a way of turning quiet negotiations into urgent decisions. Behind closed doors, league officials and player representatives were working through the complicated details of the new collective bargaining agreement. Salary structures, revenue sharing percentages, benefits and travel improvements, contract rules. Every detail had to be carefully negotiated, because once the agreement is signed, it shapes the financial structure of the league for years. But as the deadline grew closer, one question hovered over everything. What happens if they don't reach a deal? In the world of professional sports, unresolved negotiations can lead to two outcomes that fans always fear: a strike or a lockout. In a strike, players refuse to play until their demands are met. In a lockout, team owners prevent games from happening until negotiations are resolved. Either situation can disrupt an entire season. Games get postponed, schedules collapse, and fans who were just starting to follow the league may lose interest if the product disappears. That possibility is exactly why the current negotiations carry so much weight. Because the WNBA isn't just another sports league right now. It's a league experiencing a historic surge of attention, record viewership numbers, massive social media engagement, new fans discovering the sport every week. Momentum like that is extremely valuable, but it can also be fragile. History has shown that sports leagues can lose momentum quickly if seasons are interrupted. Sponsors grow cautious. Networks hesitate. Casual fans move on to other entertainment. That's why the comments from players like Clark and Bueckers about wanting the season to happen resonated with so many fans. They understood how rare this moment of growth really is. But at the same time, veteran players understand something equally important. Moments of growth are also moments of leverage. When a league becomes more valuable, players gain stronger negotiating power. And if that leverage isn't used carefully, opportunities for financial progress might disappear for years. So the league now stands at a delicate balancing point. Push too hard, and the momentum could stall. Push too little, and players might miss the chance to secure better compensation. That's the challenge facing both sides of the negotiation table. Owners want long-term financial stability. Players want fair rewards for the league's success. And somewhere between those goals lies the final agreement that will shape the WNBA's future. As the deadline approaches, fans across the basketball world are watching closely. Because what happens next could define the next era of women's professional basketball. But one thing is already certain. The debate surrounding these negotiations has revealed just how passionate fans have become about the league. People are paying attention. They are analyzing every comment. They are discussing every development. And that level of engagement is something the WNBA has spent decades trying to achieve. The real question now is whether the league can navigate this complicated moment without losing the incredible momentum it has finally built. Long before the negotiations became public drama, something else had already started reshaping the entire WNBA landscape. And it all revolved around one thing: attention. Because in modern sports, attention equals money. The more people watch your games, the more valuable your league becomes. Television networks start bidding for broadcast rights. Sponsors line up to attach their brand to the sport. Arenas fill up. Merchandise sells out. Every major sports league that reached global success followed that same formula. First comes attention. Then comes the money. And over the last couple of seasons, the WNBA has experienced something it had never quite seen at this scale before. A sudden explosion of attention. For years, the league had loyal supporters who followed teams closely and appreciated the incredible level of talent on the court. But the audience remained relatively niche compared to larger sports leagues. Then the landscape began shifting. College women's basketball started producing massive television audiences. Games began trending on social media. Highlight clips started circulating across the internet. And suddenly the entire sports world began paying attention to a new generation of stars. At the center of that surge was Caitlin Clark. Clark's playing style alone made her impossible to ignore. Deep three-point shots from distances that looked almost impossible. Fast-paced offense. High-scoring performances. And a level of confidence that turned every game into a must-watch event. Fans who had never watched women's basketball before suddenly found themselves tuning in just to see what Clark would do next. Her college games began drawing millions of viewers. Highlights flooded social media feeds. Sports debate shows that rarely discussed women's basketball suddenly started leading segments with her performances. The attention grew so quickly that arenas hosting her games began selling out weeks in advance. Ticket prices skyrocketed. Fans traveled across the country just to see her play. It wasn't just a basketball story anymore. It was a cultural moment. When Clark eventually transitioned into the professional spotlight, that momentum didn't disappear. If anything, it grew even larger. WNBA teams hosting games involving Clark saw massive spikes in attendance. Some arenas moved games to larger venues just to accommodate the demand. Television ratings surged whenever she appeared on the schedule. Merchandise sales connected to the league began climbing dramatically. For the first time in years, casual sports fans who had never followed the WNBA were now talking about it. And when casual fans start talking about a league, the business side of sports notices immediately. Television networks began paying closer attention to viewership numbers. Sponsors started exploring larger partnerships. Corporate brands recognized an opportunity to align themselves with a rapidly growing sport. Suddenly, the WNBA was no longer just a league fighting for recognition. It was becoming a league with real commercial momentum. That momentum is exactly why the current negotiations carry so much weight. Because when a sports league enters a growth phase like this, every financial conversation becomes more intense. Players recognize that the league's value is increasing. Owners recognize that the league's operating costs are also increasing as it expands. Both sides understand that the decisions made during this moment could shape the league's financial structure for years. In other words, the explosion of attention surrounding players like Clark didn't just change fan interest. It changed the entire economic conversation surrounding the WNBA. More viewers meant larger advertising deals. More advertising deals meant bigger television contracts. Bigger television contracts meant the potential for higher salaries across the league. But growth like that doesn't happen overnight. It requires careful negotiation between players and owners to determine how new revenue is distributed. That's exactly what the current CBA discussions are trying to solve. And that's why the comments made by players about protecting the season carry so much importance. Because the biggest asset the WNBA has right now is visibility. Millions of new fans discovering the league. Highlight clips going viral. Sports networks discussing the games regularly. If the games disappear during negotiations, even temporarily, that momentum could slow down. But if the league continues building on this wave of attention, the financial possibilities could grow dramatically. This is the balancing act both sides are facing. Players want fair compensation for helping create the surge in popularity. Owners want to make sure the league's long-term financial stability remains strong. And right in the center of that discussion is a simple reality. The WNBA is entering a completely new era. An era where star players carry enormous influence. An era where social media can turn a single highlight into millions of views overnight. An era where the sport is finally breaking into mainstream sports conversations around the world. But moments like this also bring pressure. Pressure to make the right decisions. Pressure to handle growth responsibly. Pressure to ensure that the momentum continues rather than fading away. Because history has shown that sports leagues don't get unlimited chances to capture the public's attention. Sometimes a single moment of momentum changes everything. And sometimes, if that momentum isn't managed carefully, it can disappear just as quickly as it arrived. That's why the current moment feels so important. The WNBA has the attention of the sports world. The players know it. The owners know it. The fans definitely know it. The question now is whether the league can turn this surge of attention into long-term success. And the answer to that question might depend on how the negotiations unfolding right now ultimately play out. Because the future of women's basketball is being shaped not just by what happens on the court, but by the decisions being made behind the scenes. When Paige Bueckers delivered her comments about the negotiations, few people expected it to ignite such a massive conversation. But the reaction revealed something fascinating about the current state of the WNBA. Fans care deeply about the direction of the league. They care about how players are treated. They care about fairness, opportunity, and the future of women's basketball. The comparison between Caitlin Clark and Paige Bueckers sparked debates about media narratives and double standards. Natasha Cloud's comments sparked discussions about salaries and financial realities. And the negotiations themselves revealed how complex professional sports business can truly be. At the end of the day, every player involved in this conversation wants the same thing: a stronger league, a bigger stage for women's basketball, and a future where the next generation of players can thrive. The path to that future, however, is rarely simple. Because progress in professional sports always involves difficult conversations about money, power, and opportunity. And right now, the WNBA is navigating all three at once. But if the league can find the right balance between growth and stability, between negotiation and momentum, this moment could become one of the most important turning points in its history. Because the spotlight on women's basketball has never been brighter. And what happens next will determine just how far that spotlight can reach. Now we want to hear from you. Do Do you think the reaction to Caitlin Clark and Paige Bueckers showed a real double standard? Do you believe the players should push harder for bigger salaries right now? Or should protecting the league's rapid growth be the top priority? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want more deep dives into the biggest stories shaping the world of basketball, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next breakdown. Because the business of sports is changing fast, and we're here to uncover the stories happening behind the scenes. We'll see you in the next video.